So I've just watched the post-fight press conference for Andy Lee, Billy Joe Saunders. And I think you've got an exciting time ahead in 2016 when the new world champion turns up to the press conference with his hands still wrapped, dressed only in his boxers. Billy Joe Saunders, I've been a fan of his for some time, and what a character he is. What a character he is. And with him and Tyson Fury possibly at the helm of British boxing in 2016, there's going to be a lot more enjoyable nights, a lot more enjoyable build-ups, and a lot more enjoyable press conferences. In terms of discussing those nights to look forward to, there seems to be three names being mentioned about for Billy Joe Saunders. The first one is a Chris Eubank Jr. rematch, obviously. The other two are fights with Miguel Cotto and also with Saul Canelo Alvarez. Let me address those two first. Miguel Cotto and Saul Canelo Alvarez, to my mind, are operating at a level where they're not necessarily worried about belts. I know Canelo's got the WBC. Is he worried about unifying that title? Probably not. The way I perceive it, and I could be wrong, but the way I perceive it is his idea is to be involved in the biggest fights against the biggest names, rather than purely focusing on unifying a division. Miguel Cotto, he's clearly another one who isn't obsessed with belts, didn't even pay his sanctioning fee for the WBC belt, and let that one go. There's also a question as to whether he'll be wanting to campaign at £154 rather than 160. I look at both of these guys and I'm not sure that they're going to want to fight Billy Joe Saunders. That's not saying that they're scared of Billy Joe Saunders. That's not even saying that Billy Joe Saunders beats them. I'm just saying I'm not sure if he's their ideal choice of opponent. Billy Joe Saunders is not a massive name on a global stage at this point. Now, don't get me wrong. Last night's fight with Andy Lee was big. It was on Showtime in the States. Jimmy Lennon Jr. was there. But whilst it was big, I don't think it was mega. I think it was big in the sense that it will appeal to a returning Peter Quillen or appeal to Danny Jacobs looking to unify. But I don't think it was big on the scale that one of the leading names in boxing, Canelo or Miguel Cotto, is necessarily going to get the fight. I would say that on a global basis, Andy Lee is probably still a bigger name than Billy Joe Saunders. Andy Lee obviously has that Irish background, and as we know, there are more Irish people in America than anywhere else really, and guys like Matthew Macklin and Andy Lee can get huge turnouts for their events. Even Spike O'Sullivan fighting out in New York, for example. I just wonder if they're looking at Billy Joe Saunders, and Billy Joe is a tough fight for anyone, and he's a tough fight for anyone because he's so awkward, he's so technical, so awkward, he moves so well, he's so slippery, southpaw, awkward angles. Do they really want that when it's not the biggest fight in the world? Sure, they'd be favourites to beat him, certainly in most people's minds, but is he the right choice of opponent at this stage? I'm not so sure. Billy Joe, Frank Warren's done an excellent job with him, but because of the fact he hasn't been on Sky, because of the fact that he hasn't been fighting internationally, his profile is maybe a bit lower than the likes of a Matthew Macklin or an Andy Lee, despite the fact he's got world title belt. I'm just not sure he'd necessarily be the first choice for those guys. To be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if Miguel Cotto returns against Matthew Macklin. Macklin's a big name, it's an easy fight. Macklin will fight at any weight Miguel Cotto wants him to, be that 154, 155, 160. That makes more sense to me, because I just don't see Miguel and Canelo being motivated by belts. How does Billy Joe do against both of those guys? They're both top fights. They're both step-ups from anything he's fought before. I don't rule him out of either, though. Funnily enough, stylistically, Canelo, he's been given problems by movers before. The likes of Erislandy Lara, the likes of Austin Trout. Floyd Mayweather showed that it was very possible to outbox the guy. Now, don't get me wrong, Canelo's improved massively. He looked like a very dangerous fighter last time out against Miguel Cotto. I don't rule Billy Joe Saunders out, though. It's a tight fight in my mind. But the fight that, let's be honest, is the more realistic, the fight that's actually worth discussing is the Chris Eubank Jr. rematch. Let me say, it's no surprise to me that Chris Eubank Jr. has parted ways with Eddie Hearn at this time, now that this big fight is available. in terms of the money angle, Billy Joe Saunders does appear to be an individual motivated by money, which is fair enough in this sport. But in terms of the money angle, I would imagine that a Billy Joe Saunders Chris Eubank fight is possibly a bigger payday for Billy Joe than Miguel Cotto, Saul Canelo Alvarez, even than Golovkin. You know, the interest in that fight is huge. Chris Eubank Jr., like him, hate him, he is becoming a bit of a sensation. You know, this guy has a following. This guy commands interest. You know, regardless of whether he's a good fighter or not, he is a fantastic showman. He is a great personality to have within the sport. And mixing these two together is like mixing fire and oil. You know, it's explosive. It's going to be a huge, huge build-up, and the fans are going to absolutely love it. You know, this is a big fight for me. I don't know where they'd hold it, the O2, maybe even outdoors, you know, but there would be real interest in this fight. I noticed Box Nation are launching some sort of pay-per-view service. They've initially marketed it as a way that non-subscribers to Box Nation can pay-per-view for a one-off event. Don't be surprised if a fight like this gets made if we start seeing pay-per-view full-time, you know, because it's going to generate that much interest. But it's a big money fight. It's a fight that could be so valuable to Frank Warren, not even because of the fight itself, because of the number of subscribers that would have to go to Box Nation in order to get the fight on. So I think that one's realistic. You know, it's the money fight. And if you're Billy Joe Saunders, you beat the guy before, it's probably an easier fight for more money than fighting in a unifying title match. It also helps the likes of Cotto and Golovkin, who are not spring chickens, get another 6 months older, which is no negative before those fights. How the fight goes, Eubank versus Billy Joe Saunders. Let me say this, both have improved since the rematch. You know, Billy Joe against Andy Lee put in a much more mature performance than he did against Chris Eubank Jr. He was much more disciplined, he looked much fitter, he was much less eager, and whilst people say he did slow in the last rounds, for me that was more to do with Andy Lee coming on strong. I thought Billy Joe showed a much better engine and a much better capability to fight into the late rounds in this fight. Possibly because it was a slower pace in the earlier rounds. Yeah, Billy Joe has improved. He really has. Likewise, Chris Eubank Jr. has also improved. Yeah, his performance against Spike O'Sullivan, he looked like a wrecking ball in there. My question is, was Eubank's improved? And was Billy Joe's improved? Let's put it this way. If you look back at their initial fight, what would you say Billy Joe needed to do better? Well, he needed to have a better engine, and he needed to fight better in the later rounds of that fight for me. And he possibly needed to rely more on his boxing. I think he's answered all three of those questions in the Andy Lee rematch. Don't forget, Andy Lee is a bigger puncher than Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. is no one-shot knockout puncher. But for me, Billy Joe showed in his performance last night that he's improved in those areas. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. has improved. I'm not going to take that away from him. But for me, what are the areas, looking back at that Billy Joe-Chris Eubank fight, that Eubank needed to improve on? He couldn't deal with the movement. He couldn't block the jab. And he was too inaccurate. Has he fought a fighter who moves since that fight? No. Is he still getting caught with punches that a real slick operator would never get caught with? Yes. Spike Sullivan never landed a glove on Billy Joe Saunders, whereas he caught Eubank with haymakers. For me, Billy Joe's performance 2 years ago against Spike was actually more impressive than Chris Eubank Jr.'s perhaps more entertaining fight, but, you know, for me, Billy Joe's was more impressive. Thirdly, accuracy. You know, you still see Eubank loading up on punches, setting his feet, and throwing wild hooks. He's not the sort of guy who's a mobile fighter throwing a variety of punches. For me, he stands in front of a stationary opponent, sets his feet, and gets to work. Can't do that against Billy Joe. Billy Joe's moving, weaving, ducking, slipping, bobbing. You know, an awkward southpaw. My point is, both guys have got better. But Billy Joe's got better in the areas that were a concern to me. Eubank's got better in areas that were never really a concern. You know, he's looking like he's grinding down opponents, throwing a lot of punches, throwing a lot of hooks and uppercuts. You know, he was always good in that area. He was always a better fighter than Billy Joe Saunders in that area. But I don't think the issues that Billy Joe exposed in this game have been suitably addressed in his recent fights. It wouldn't surprise me if Billy Joe still couldn't miss with the jab. It wouldn't surprise me if Billy Joe still could make Eubank look massively inaccurate. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Billy Joe could still use his footwork to run rings around Chris Eubank Jr. He's just a more advanced technician. If this fight happens, you know, Chris Eubank Jr. is a threat. He does a lot right. But he's not addressing the fundamental problems in his game. And I think those problems at present will make him come up short at world level. And Billy Joe Saunders is now world level, you know. I said in my initial post-fight video there's an argument that he could be the number 2 middleweight in the world. Well, let's talk about that briefly. Golovkin is the number 1 middleweight in the world. Then you've got Canelo. Is Canelo really a middleweight? Possibly not. He wants to fight at 155 by all accounts. Some people are saying he'll fight at 160. We shall see. I'll reserve judgment on that. Depending on what he does with his weight. Because obviously if he stays at 155 it's going to stop him from getting involved in certain fights. You'd have to say Peter Quillen, who was my long-term number 2, is out of the running after his recent performance. And you'd have to say Danny Jacobs, by virtue of that, is also up for debate. But for me, Saul Canelo Alvarez, Danny Jacobs, Billy Joe Saunders, that is the tier just below Golovkin. Just below Golovkin. And I've got those 3 ahead right now of names like David Lemieux, Peter Quillen, Hassan and Jickham. You know, I've got them ahead of that. Let me know your thoughts on this fight. Eubank versus Billy Joe Saunders. I understand it's going to be a controversial one. But I'm very much looking forward to it if it does happen. It's going to be a Fight of the Year candidate for 2016. Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, do give me the thumbs up. Got a few big videos planned. I've got another one on the middleweight division tomorrow. Where I'm going to discuss Canelo versus Golovkin, if that fight is to be made. So if you enjoyed the chat, please subscribe to the channel. Wouldn't want you to miss out on some of the stuff I've got coming. Thanks a lot for watching.